I'm Scott Doney from the University of Virginia, and I'm going to talk today about some important problems in ocean acidification, namely how can we detect trends, how can we attribute that to human causes versus natural causes, and how can we assess predictability of ocean acidification looking into the future. This is becoming a growing question because both climate change and ocean acidification are affecting marine ecosystems, and we need to be able to understand the magnitude of those effects and how those effects impact things like the ability of the ocean to continue to take up atmospheric CO2, thus slowing climate change, how acidification and warming might impact productivity in the biological pump with feedbacks to marine fisheries, ocean health, and marine ecosystem services, and how, as we start to deploy climate adaptation and mitigation solutions, how those solutions are being affected by climate change, and also whether we can detect if they're actually working and are effective. So for ocean acidification, detection and attribution is really problem dependent. There are some parts of the problem that we can do quite well, and there are other problems where we're still challenged by a lack of scientific understanding and a lack of appropriate observational capability. So for example, starting here, increased atmospheric CO2 we can attribute quite well to human activities such as fossil fuel burning and deforestation. And at least for the open ocean, the changes in seawater chemistry associated with the uptake of excess CO2 from the atmosphere can be quite well documented and quite well attributed. As we move into more coastal waters where there's more natural variability and other factors that can affect seawater chemistry, so things like changes in runoff, nutrient pollution, it becomes more challenging to attribute signals to long-term growth in atmospheric CO2. And as we move into biological impacts of acidification and separating those from, for example, climate change and other long-term pressures on the ecosystem, it becomes more challenging. And then, of course, ultimately, we'd like to understand these impacts on social and economic systems, so coastal communities, fisheries, and other human activities that are reliant on marine ecosystems. So let's start at the simplest, which is the rise in atmospheric CO2. I'm showing here on the left the Keeling curve. This is the atmospheric CO2 mixing ratio from Mauna Loa Observatory that's been measured since the late 1950s. We have ice core records throughout the Holocene and going back hundreds of thousands of years, and we know that the pre-industrial atmosphere CO2 mixing ratio was about 280. It was about 315 when Dave Keeling first started making his measurements. It's now over 420. So we've seen about a 50% increase in atmospheric CO2 since the pre-industrial period. This can be attributed quite well to human activities, in particular fossil fuel burning and land use, things like deforestation and agricultural practices. This can be done through analysis of carbon cycle inventories and also through isotopic data and footprints from the patterns of atmospheric CO2 deduced from satellites and from surface measurements. So for comparison, this is showing here the cumulative effect of fossil fuel emissions on atmospheric CO2, the effect of land use, and then the sinks. So there's a land sink that's a combination of CO2 fertilization. More CO2 in the atmosphere leads to some plants growing faster. You have climate change effects, and you also have legacy effects from past land use. So for example, areas that were deforested that are now reforested over time. You have a substantial ocean sink that right now is removing about a quarter of human emissions, and then you have the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. We can detect the change in ocean carbon storage and actually diagnose the distributions of this excess carbon dioxide in seawater This has been developed over several decades through a series of ocean surveys that have gone out and measured not only the amount of inorganic carbon, but hydrographic properties, nutrients, other biogeochemical properties. This is a reconstruction from a recent study that used that survey data to look at the change in anthropogenic CO2 over about a decade, over about a 10-year period. So these are measurements based on repeat surveys of the same hydrographic lines. The data has been corrected for small-scale variations in ocean physics and biogeochemistry. Other approaches for detecting anthropogenic CO2 in the ocean use transient tracers, things like chlorofluorocarbons that have industrial sources and that can be matched to the rise in atmospheric CO2, and also numerical circulation models that have been calibrated both with transient tracers and long-term background tracers such as radiocarbon. We can also detect the buildup of inorganic carbon in the surface ocean. In this case, DIC stands for dissolved inorganic carbon. This is now more than 30-year record from the Bermuda Atlantic Time Series station. And you see over time that dissolved inorganic carbon has gone up in the surface water. The orange dots are the anomalies correcting for background variations. And in the bottom panel, you see the same increase, but now instead of dissolved inorganic carbon, this is anthropogenic carbon. So the circles are the dissolved inorganic carbon, and these are the orange are the estimates of how much of that is due to anthropogenic carbon, so correcting for the natural background. So the combination of the long-term repeat global surveys and these open ocean time series stations, there's several of them that now have multi-decadal records, provide strong constraints on the oceanic uptake of anthropogenic CO2. Now we know that, now this is now showing in red, this is the Mauna Loa record I showed earlier. The blue is surface PCO2 off of Hawaii. We know that as additional CO2 is added to the surface ocean, that it shifts seawater chemistry. It makes the water more acidic, so the pH is actually decreasing with time, and it lowers the carbonate ion concentration. And this is important because many organisms use carbonate ions to build shells out of calcium carbonate. And so commonly, different organisms might respond to different aspects of the inorganic carbon system. So some organisms might be more responsive to the amount of aqueous CO2 if they're using that for photosynthesis. Some organisms might respond to changes in acid-base chemistry, and many shell-forming organisms are probably most sensitive to this decline in the CO2 concentration. One of the issues as we move from Hawaii into some of these coastal sites where we have many fisheries and many important and valuable large marine ecosystems is that we see larger and larger amounts of natural variability. So not just seasonal variations, but for example, in the California current, you have upwelling events, you have a large range in variations in not just PCO2, but all aspects of the CO2 system. And this gets even worse as you move into, for example, coastal lagoons and estuaries. And so we need a way to diagnose this natural variability and separate natural variability from long-term pressures associated with rising atmospheric CO2. There's an excellent series of observational systems that have been deployed over the last several years. This is just showing one NOAA buoy from the Gulf of Maine, showing high-frequency pH measurements over the last several years. And one of the interesting opportunities is we can now diagnose the background seasonal cycle and also some of these extreme events. So for example, here in this panel, we're showing the saturation state for aragonite. So this is using the carbonate ion data. So this is a measure of how organisms might be seeing the changes in the CO2 system in terms of building shells out of calcium carbonate. And you can actually from the high frequency data, look at the distribution and frequency of extreme events with low saturation state for aragonite, or similarly low values for pH. So these observational data sets are really providing a new glimpse into the frequency of these strong events. In terms of detection, attribution, and prediction, that's usually done framed in terms of some sort of model, either a statistical model or a dynamical model, and can really fold in different sources of uncertainty. Because of the high frequency variability in the ocean, we really need to know the current state of the ocean or the initial condition of the ocean if you were to make a prediction. And so because we don't know that perfectly, the initial conditions or initialization is a major source of uncertainty. At the other end of the spectrum, as we start to project into the future, one of the biggest sources of uncertainty is human behavior. What are going to be the future emissions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere? Are we on a high emission pathway, or are we on a low emission pathway? So predicting out on timescales of decades, you really, one of the major sources of uncertainty is these scenarios. In the middle, between sort of the initial value problem on the scale of weeks to months and the scenarios, are the decadal prediction problem or the multi-annual prediction problem, where their model uncertainty, whether it's a statistical model or a dynamical model, really comes into play. This has been well documented now for a number of years for other factors in the ocean carbon system, so particularly ocean carbon uptake. So this is a really nice study that Nikki Lewandowski's group led, where they looked starting here from using the same model, so no model uncertainty, it's always the same model, but looking at a series or ensemble of simulations using different starting spots. So they looked at two different scenarios, one in blue with a low CO2 pathway and one in red for a high CO2 pathway. And you can see that over time, the uncertainty, so the error in the prediction, tended to grow. And you can see the partitioning of that variability, where early on internal variability, so this is that initialization problem, was quite large, but over time the scenario problem dominated, basically whether you were on the blue line or the red line. If you move over here, they're now looking at multiple different models and multiple different scenarios, and you see that the dominance, at least for the decadal problem, is model uncertainty. Within each one of these colored clouds, which are the scenarios, you see wide variability from model to model. The same sorts of sources of variability will plague estimates of anthropogenic CO2 and the effect in terms of ocean acidification. Another way of thinking about this problem in terms of detection is to think about what are the thresholds. So if you were to have an observational data set, at one point would you say that the system had moved away from some previous state? So if we were to say there's a long-term pressure or press from anthropogenic CO2, at what point has that press moved beyond the natural variability? So this is a modeling study by Claudine Hari's group, looking in the California current. And she's defined, for example, with these blue lines, for each of these different properties, what for different regions, so the northern region, central region, and southern region, this is for aragonite saturation state in the surface waters. And what you see is that the blue lines define the threshold for contemporary conditions. And over time, the variability in the model exceeds and moves outside that natural envelope. Now that's using the current conditions as baseline. If you were to go back to pre-industrial, you see that the entire simulation is always outside the pre-industrial conditions. So in terms of ecosystems, they're being pushed by this long-term pressure of declining aragonite saturation state. And over a few decades, that shifts large enough that this anthropogenic pressure becomes clear outside the natural envelope of variability. Another way of thinking about this same question, and again, this is some work from Claudine Hari's group at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, now for the Gulf of Alaska, is to try to define the regional climate variability in terms of some statistical approach, in this case using empirical orthogonal functions. So here I'm showing on the left-hand side the surface aragonite saturation state for different seasons, and you see large seasonal variations with low values of saturation state during the winter and up in some of the coastal embayments, higher values during the summer offshore. On the right-hand side, I'm showing a measure of physical variability in terms of sea surface height, where you see coherent regional variability on a large scale offshore that's also associated with changes in seawater chemistry, because as the physics changes, you're bringing up more subsurface water that's rich in CO2 that has a lower pH and a lower aragonite saturation state. So upwelling affects sea surface height and also the chemistry. We can look at the long-term variability of that. The yellow are regions are periods of time when you have positive values of this variability index associated with sea surface height. And you see that it's tied into, for example, during this multi-year period here, that regional variability index based on the physics is reflected in variations in salinity, temperature, nitrate, PCO2, aragonite, and pH. So you have coherent regional variations in ocean physics and corresponding biogeochemical measures, including the CO2 system. And this can allow us, similarly to what we were seeing in previously with the mooring, to look at distributions over time of properties such as aragonite saturation and look at, for example, these low saturation events and the distribution of that and frequency of that. And you see this long-term pressure due to anthropogenic CO2, so saturation state is declining. And then you see these, for example, these events where you have regional physical variations that drive upwelling, that drive lower saturation. And so we can start to diagnose from easily measured physical properties such as sea surface height, time periods where we might expect more pressure from more high frequency extreme events of ocean acidification. And this also provides some predictive power of whether once we know something about the background controls on some of this physical variability. As we move into coastal waters, in addition to rising atmospheric CO2, we also have to be concerned about nutrient pollution. And nutrients can get into surface waters from local runoff, into groundwaters and into estuaries, and also from atmospheric deposition coming from sources inland, either from agricultural sources from excess fertilizer use or from fossil fuel combustion that makes nitrous oxides. Once it gets into surface waters, it can cause substantial nutrient eutrophication. And when the organisms, when the plankton blooms occur, when those plankton blooms die, they release a lot of CO2, lead to acidification events, and are also tied in with low oxygen events. So in coastal waters, you see a direct link often between ocean acidification and hypoxia. This is some work from Jenny Rubin from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution looking at coastal acidification in Buzzards Bay, which is a region in southeast Massachusetts where you have a number of coastal estuaries and embayments with long-term observational data. In the top panel is shown the aragonite saturation as a function of salinity. For waters in this region, the surface waters are relatively acidic, and so you have low saturation state at the freshwater end member. The black lines are the mixing curves you'd expect between coastal waters and the freshwater end members. And what you see are large deviations below that line associated with the red and pink colors, which are places where you have high apparent oxygen utilization. So in places where you have a lot of excess nutrients, a lot of biogeochemistry that's drawing down the oxygen, you're also releasing CO2, and that's leading to lower saturation states for these waters. Similarly, these same high AOU waters you see are low pH waters. So you have a way of connecting coastal acidification, in this case, to oxygen, low oxygen waters. And in fact, we can take these estimates of the change in saturation state due to biogeochemistry and compare them to total nitrogen. So what you see is that this offset from the mixing line associated with biogeochemistry gets larger in systems that have more total nitrogen. So this is tying nutrient pollution and tying the attribution of these highly affected coastal acidification sites to excess nutrient pollution. And in fact, in the paper, Rubin et al. Looked at what would happen if we were to compare measured sites in blue to what would happen, for example, if we were to meet TMDL thresholds. So these are pollution thresholds associated with reducing nutrient pollution. And what you see is, particularly for some of the more impacted sites where you see very low saturation states, if we were to remove the pressure from the nutrient pollution, you'd see a large jump back towards more healthy and higher aragonite saturation states. So in addition to the atmospheric CO2 problem, there is also a substantial problem from coastal nutrient pollution, and we're developing ways to attribute the short-term effects of nutrient pollution and separate those from the effects of rising atmospheric CO2. Now, as we move into biological responses, I've mostly up to this point been talking about seawater chemistry. It becomes much more challenging to detect and attribute in the field changes in marine ecosystems and marine organism dynamics, whether it's physiology, population dynamics, or community structure. There have been quite a bit of work in laboratory and mesocosms, and this is just showing a recent synthesis from a review paper looking at, for example, seagrass meadows or carbonate reefs, coral reefs, pelagic food webs, of what we expect to see based on a variety of different studies. There have been some really interesting work, particularly in pelagic food webs associated with pteropods, a type of marine snail, where they can actually start to attribute and detect and attribute long-term changes in the distribution of pteropods and in the health of pteropods in terms of the structure of their shell and the dissolution of their shell. But for many of these systems, we're still at the experimental and process level stage. And that leads to how are we going to move forward, right? Where there's multiple aspects of this in terms of how ocean acidification is going to affect biological systems. Right? We've been focused primarily on ocean acidification, but we know that there are multiple drivers that organisms are going to be seeing. So in addition to acidification, they're going to be seeing warming in many coastal systems. They're seeing excess nutrients. So we need to think about the drivers in terms of multiple factors. In terms of biological levels of organization, it's not just individual species. We need to know how those species are interacting and how those perturbations at the species level then drive changes at the community level and the ecosystem level. And then also, we're often limited in how long we can do perturbation experiments in the lab or the mesocosm. And will organisms be able to acclimate to changes, for example, in seawater chemistry, or over longer time periods actually adapt in an evolutionary sense? And so we're starting to fill out different approaches using mesocosms and laboratory experiments, natural analogs such as CO2 volcanic events, but we still have a ways to go in order to get to what we actually want to know, which is, well, how will ecosystems respond to multiple drivers over long periods of time to this gradual pressure of anthropogenic CO2. And then finally, another paradigm that's related is to start to think about ocean acidification risk, particularly in terms of relating changes in seawater chemistry and marine biology and biogeochemistry to ecosystem effects and socioeconomic processes. And so one approach is to use a hazard exposure vulnerability risk model, where we would focus on places where we know that there's substantial hazard, which would be both anthropogenic CO2, but perhaps also these coastal acidification sources, where you then see exposure of biological and socioeconomic systems. Where are the most, where are systems seeing some of the strongest effects, and then focus on the vulnerability of those systems. For example, looking at fisheries, are we looking at shellfish aquaculture? Are we looking at marine fisheries that are highly dependent either directly on shellfish or indirectly as prey species for the fisheries? And then that can help us think about processes to adapt or mitigate some of these damages, whether it's shifting the species that's focus of aquaculture, for example, changing governance or fisheries management practices, or even focus on improving the conditions for the coastal communities in places where we know ocean acidification is going to have some of the biggest effects. Well, thank you. Again, I hope this was a helpful lecture, and I look forward to talking to people in the question and answer period.